In the endless blue of the Pacific, silence was both weapon and shield. Beneath the rolling waves in 1944, the U.S. submarine USS Barb prowled like a ghost. Commanded by Commander Eugene Fluckey, the Barb had already carved a legend in the submarine fleet, bold, unpredictable, and defiant of every conventional rule of undersea warfare. Yet no one aboard could imagine that this daring crew would soon become the first in history to attack and destroy a train, while beneath the ocean's surface. The Pacific had become an ocean of shadows. Japan's once proud merchant navy lay crippled, but their supply routes still pulsed like veins feeding the war machine. Every cargo ship sunk was another wound, yet Japan adapted quickly, using coastal trains to move weapons, troops, and fuel beyond the reach of Allied aircraft. That's when Fluckey, restless and daring, saw a new challenge, one that no admiral would have ever sanctioned. The USS Barb, sleek and menacing, had been forged for underwater warfare, yet its commander dreamed of taking the fight onto land. Fluckey's crew, hardened by months of combat patrols, had seen the ocean become a graveyard of steel and fire. They had survived depth charges, hunted convoys and torpedo duels that tested sanity itself. Still, the Pacific War's monotony bred a hunger for something bold, something that struck deeper than the torpedo's blast. A message to the enemy that nowhere, not even the mainland, was safe. The crew idolized their skipper. Fluckey wasn't the kind of officer to hide behind procedures. He believed in aggression tempered by precision, in audacity guided by intellect. Hit hard, hit fast, and disappear, he'd say. A mantra that turned the Barb into a hunter, feared by Japanese convoys from Formosa to Hokkaido. Under his command, the Barb destroyed 16 enemy ships, earning 4 battle stars and a Presidential Unit citation. But the legend was just beginning. In January 1945, as the Pacific tides shifted in favor of the Allies, Fluckey received a mission that seemed routine: patrol the coast of Sakhalin Island, off northern Japan, and intercept supply routes still feeding the war effort. Yet to the restless commander, routine was an invitation to rewrite history. As the Barb glided silently through the northern waters, sonar pinging in the dark, Fluckey studied the coastline through his periscope. There, hugging the cliffs, ran a thin silver line, the coastal railway. He watched as trains thundered past, their boxcars filled with munitions and soldiers. For most commanders, it was an untouchable target. For Fluckey, it was opportunity incarnate. "We can reach it," he murmured. "If we can reach it, we can destroy it." The idea seemed madness. A submarine attacking a train. No naval officer had ever attempted such a thing. But aboard the Barb, madness was often the seed of genius. His officers exchanged cautious looks, half amused, half in awe. Yet none doubted that their skipper meant every word. The Pacific was about to witness an operation so audacious, so unthinkable, that it would be studied for generations. A submarine, a train, and a crew of men unafraid to defy the limits of war. This was where history bent toward legend. When Commander Eugene Fluckey first proposed striking a Japanese train, even his seasoned crew thought he had finally lost his grip on reality. They had seen the impossible many times: destroyers evaded, convoys ambushed, and narrow escapes from depth charges, but storming the enemy's homeland from a submarine was something else entirely. The USS Barb had just returned from a brutal patrol off China's coast, where she had sunk multiple cargo ships. Her hull still bore the scars of near misses, her men weary but unbroken. Fluckey gathered them in the wardroom one quiet evening. The map of Hokkaido and Sakhalin spread across the table, his eyes gleaming with that reckless spark they'd come to know. "Gentlemen," he began, "we're going ashore." Laughter erupted. Surely the captain was joking. But when he unrolled an aerial photo of the coastal railway line, the laughter died. He pointed at the thin curve of track near Karafuto, the southern part of Sakhalin Island, still under Japanese control. "Trains loaded with munitions, supplies, maybe even troops. They run here every few hours. If we hit them, we don't just sink steel. We shatter logistics. And we do it where they least expect us." The idea was as dangerous as it was brilliant. The Barb would have to surface dangerously close to shore, within range of Japanese patrols. A small team would go ashore under the cover of night, plant explosives on the track, and vanish before dawn. Every man knew one mistake would mean death or capture. Yet as Fluckey outlined the details, excitement began to replace doubt. This was no ordinary mission. It was history in the making. For the captain, the war had become more than tonnage sunk or ships destroyed. It was about innovation, about proving that imagination could be as powerful as firepower. Fluckey's unorthodox leadership had already made Barb the most feared submarine in the Pacific Fleet. He often led from the periscope, driving his men with calm confidence and humor, even under fire. The more dangerous it looks, he'd quip, the safer it probably is because the enemy won't believe we'd dare. Planning took days. The engineers modified depth charges into time-delayed explosives. The navigators charted tide cycles and moon phases for a silent approach. Volunteers were requested for the shore team, but nearly every hand shot up. The captain finally selected 8 men, his best swimmers, mechanics, and gunners. Their mission: strike the track, vanish into the sea, and leave the Japanese stunned. The odds were staggering. If detected, there would be no rescue. Japanese forces on Sakhalin were still well-armed and paranoid, expecting landings after recent raids on the home islands, but Barb's crew trusted their captain's instincts. Fluckey had a reputation for turning impossible odds into triumph. "They think we're trapped by the ocean," he told them. "But the ocean is our cloak." On the night of July 22, 1945, the submarine slipped through the waves toward the Sakhalin coast. Her engines hummed softly, deck guns covered in salt spray. The men prepared in silence, checking their gear by red light. Above them, a sliver of moon cast ghostly silver over the sea. The skipper stood on the bridge, binoculars steady, scanning the dark shoreline. Somewhere beyond those hills, trains rumbled with cargo bound for the collapsing Japanese empire. "We've sunk their ships," he said quietly. "Now let's blow up their train." Below deck, the crew exchanged nervous grins. They weren't just submariners anymore. They were commandos of the deep, about to carry out one of the boldest raids of the Second World War. The coast of Karafuto loomed like a dark spectre under a moonless sky. It was past midnight when the Barb surfaced, just a few hundred yards off the beach, her silhouette merging with the Black Sea. The men could hear faint mechanical clatters in the distance, an approaching train somewhere beyond the hills. The 8-man shore party assembled silently on the deck, dressed in black fatigues, faces streaked with grease. They carried carbines, demolition packs, and a single coil of wire that would connect their fate to the explosive charge. Commander Fluckey, watching from the bridge, gave a final nod. "Make it count, boys," he said softly. Then, in complete silence, they slipped into the cold Pacific, their raft gliding toward the enemy shore. The surf was rough, the tide deceptive. Every splash could betray them. When they reached the beach, they dragged the raft behind a dune and crouched low, the smell of pine and damp earth mingling with fear. One of them whispered, "It feels like the whole damn island's listening." The men moved inland, crawling through tall grass until they found the track. The steel rails gleamed faintly under starlight. Using their modified charge, a 55-pound demolition bomb rigged with a micro-switch, they set to work. They buried the device beneath the ties, connecting it to a small pressure plate designed to trigger when the train's wheels passed over. Every tick of the watch felt like thunder. For 30 tense minutes they worked, hands numb, eyes darting at every sound. At one point, the distant rumble of another train froze them in place. They pressed into the dirt, breath held as it roared past, oblivious. When the danger passed, they finished arming the bomb and began the crawl back toward the beach. Time seemed to stretch forever. The men reached their raft just before dawn's first grey light touched the horizon. Out at sea, the Barb waited, engines idling. The last man pushed off the shore and looked back, an empty coastline, silent, unaware of its fate. As the submarine submerged to safety, every eye turned to the shoreline, waiting for the explosion that would define their legacy. At 1:47 a.m., the night erupted. A blinding flash tore through the darkness, followed by a thunderous roar that rolled across the sea. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air as a Japanese supply train disintegrated, carriages flipping like toys. The Barb's crew erupted in cheers below deck. They had done it, the impossible. For the first time in history, a submarine crew had attacked and destroyed an enemy train. Their strike severed a vital Japanese transport link and sent shockwaves through military intelligence. Even Fluckey, grinning ear to ear, allowed himself a rare moment of awe. "Well," he laughed, "we've officially taken the war to the railroad." The Barb slipped back into the deep, disappearing before the Japanese could respond. Behind them, the coastline still burned. a scar on the Empire's final months. News of the Barb's raid rippled through the Pacific like a seismic shock. In every wardroom and operations tent, men shook their heads in disbelief. A submarine had blown up a train, something so audacious even the brass thought it a tall tale. But then came the photographs. Grainy reconnaissance images showed a mangled stretch of track, twisted steel, and charred train cars scattered like children's toys. It wasn't a rumor. It was a message. Commander Eugene Fluckey and his crew had redefined what a submarine could do. Admiral Lockwood, commander of the Pacific submarine fleet, couldn't suppress a grin when he read the after-action report. The Barb, he said, doesn't just sink ships, she rewrites the manual. In Tokyo, panic replaced disbelief. Japanese commanders had long considered their home territories untouchable. The mainland's rail lines were thought safe from the sea. Now no coastline felt secure. Patrol boats swarmed the northern waters, searchlights scouring the waves, but the Barb was already gone, vanished into the abyss like a ghost. Below the surface, her crew celebrated quietly. They had not just destroyed a train, they had struck the enemy's confidence. For Fluckey, that was worth more than any medal. His war was psychological as much as physical. Fear, he told his men, is a weapon, and we just armed it. The raid's details spread quickly through Allied ranks. Submarine captains who once followed standard patrol patterns began to think differently. Innovation had proven deadlier than firepower. In one act of courage, Barb had turned imagination into strategy. Yet amid the pride there was gravity. Every man aboard knew how close they'd come to disaster. The Japanese garrison had been less than a mile away. If the tide had shifted, if the watchmen had looked east instead of west, they'd have been caught. The sea had protected them that night, but fate's margin was razor-thin. As the crew gathered for a toast in the cramped mess, one of the younger sailors raised his mug. "To the craziest captain alive," he said. Laughter filled the hull. Fluckey smiled but didn't reply. He knew that courage often walked hand in hand with madness, and that their success had come at a time when the world itself was burning out. The war's end was near. Japan was crumbling, yet the fight remained brutal. Fluckey's mission was not over. Every patrol still carried the risk of never returning. But in that dimly lit submarine, surrounded by men who had faced death with steady hands and fearless hearts, the commander allowed himself a rare reflection. The Barb had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol. A reminder that even in the darkest waters, human ingenuity could pierce the surface of war's madness and reveal something extraordinary. As dawn broke over the northern Pacific, the sea lay eerily calm. The Barb cruised silently beneath the waves, her hull gliding through green twilight. The men were exhausted but restless, replaying the explosion over and over in their minds, the flash, the thunder, the sight of an empire's arteries being severed in one blinding instant. "That was for every ship they sank," murmured one of the torpedo men. The captain heard him and nodded. The Barb had taken vengeance, yes, but it wasn't born of hatred. It was precision, discipline, and a relentless drive to outthink the enemy. Above the water, the Japanese scrambled to understand what had happened. Patrols swept the coastline, finding fragments of an American fuse and strange impressions in the sand, footprints leading to the surf. The idea that U.S. sailors had set foot on Japanese soil was both humiliating and terrifying. It suggested that the Americans could strike anywhere, anytime. Tokyo's propaganda machine tried to bury the story, but whispers spread among soldiers and civilians alike. A train destroyed from the sea? It was unthinkable, and that made it unforgettable. Meanwhile, aboard the Barb, life returned to the rhythm of patrol. The crew scrubbed decks, checked engines, and shared quiet meals. But beneath the routine pulsed something new, an awareness that they had become part of legend. When radio messages came through from Fleet Command, the crew learned their feat had earned the Barb another Presidential Unit citation. Yet for Fluckey, the medals were secondary. What mattered was the message the world would take from their mission. "We've proven what imagination can do," he told his officers. "If there's one lesson from this war, it's that courage isn't just charging forward. It's daring to think differently." His words would stay with them long after the patrol ended. The Barb's logbook would later list 29 enemy ships destroyed, a record unmatched by any other American submarine. But the train raid would stand apart. It wasn't the most destructive attack, but it was the boldest, and boldness often echoes longer than destruction. By late July 1945, the Barb turned her bow toward Midway, her final patrol of the war complete. The Pacific was still, but the silence carried an unspoken weight. Japan's empire was collapsing, its cities reduced to ashes by relentless bombing. The men aboard the Barb knew the war's end was near, but the sea demanded respect until the last mile. As they surfaced under a violet dawn, the crew gathered on deck, faces wind-burned, eyes tired but proud. They had done the impossible and lived to tell it. Radio chatter confirmed what everyone hoped. The Allies were closing in and surrender talks were imminent. For Fluckey, the journey home was bittersweet. He looked out over the waves, the horizon painted in gold. "We fought the war our way," he said quietly, "and we made it count." The men cheered, but behind their smiles lay reflection. They had risked everything, crossed enemy shores and rewritten naval warfare. Yet they were still just men, sailors far from home, craving normalcy after years of chaos. When they reached Pearl Harbor, the docks erupted in applause. News crews and officers greeted them like heroes. But when asked about the raid, Fluckey only smiled and said, "It was teamwork, that's all it ever was." The humility made the legend stronger. The Barb was decommissioned soon after, her battle flag adorned with 29 rising sun emblems, each marking a kill, and one small train stitched beneath them, a quiet symbol of genius and audacity. Beneath the soft hum of the USS Barb's engines, the crew prepared for what would become one of the most daring acts of the Pacific War. Commander Eugene Fluckey gathered his men in the dimly lit wardroom. The submarine swayed gently with the tide, its steel hull whispering like a restless beast. Fluckey's eyes scanned the circle of tired, lean faces, veterans hardened by months of patrols and near-death escapes. He didn't speak with bravado, only purpose. "Gentlemen," he began, "we've sunk ships, destroyed convoys, and struck fear into their fleet. But tonight we're going to do something no submarine has ever done. We're going ashore." A quiet murmur spread through the room. Sure, that was madness. Submariners lived and died by stealth. The very thought of setting foot on enemy soil was unthinkable. Yet Fluckey's voice carried the calm of conviction. "There's a railway along this coast, feeding Japan's northern front. Every train on it carries fuel, munitions, soldiers. We can hit it. If we do, we'll cripple one of their last supply routes." No one argued. On the Barb, orders weren't questioned, they were believed in. Each man trusted Fluckey with his life, and he had never led them wrong. When he smiled faintly and added, "We'll make it home to tell this story," they believed that too. The plan was simple in theory, impossible in execution. 8 volunteers would slip ashore under the cover of darkness, plant explosives on the railway, and vanish before the next patrol or train passed. The charges would detonate when the next locomotive rolled over the line. No gunfire, no alarms, just a sudden thunderclap that would echo across the Japanese coast. Fluckey selected his men: Bill Walker, Paul Saunders, Billy Hatfield, Francis Seavey, Ed Whitman, and 3 others. All veterans, all steady under fire. They were the chosen few who would carry the war directly to Japan's doorstep. That night, as the Barb surfaced near the Hokkaido coast, the black water shimmered like oil beneath a waning moon. The men readied their inflatable boat, silently lowering it into the sea. The sub's deck gun crew stood ready, scanning the horizon for patrol boats. Fluckey, standing by the conning tower, watched as his men rowed toward shore. He knew he might never see them again. Each man carried a small carbine, a pistol, and demolition charges built from the sub's stockpile. In their packs, rations, flashlights, and courage, they rowed through the cold surf, the rhythmic splash of oars lost in the wind. The shoreline loomed, a dark, jagged silhouette against a restless sky. For the first time in the war, American combat boots touched the soil of Japan itself. No fanfare, no orders from high command, just 8 men on a suicide mission for history. On board the Barb, silence reigned. Every sailor stood at their post, listening to the distant static of the radio, waiting. Inside, Fluckey checked his watch. The success of the mission now rested entirely on the men he trusted most. The hum of the engines was the only heartbeat in the darkness. In that moment, 300 feet of steel and 80 men held their breath, hoping that when dawn came they'd still be there to hear the explosion that would echo across the world. The sea whispered against the black rocks of Hokkaido as 8 American sailors crept inland through a tangle of pines. Above them, The northern wind carried the scent of frost and smoke, mingling with the faint rumble of a distant locomotive echoing down the coast. Every step was a gamble. The men from the USS Barb were miles from their submarine deep inside enemy territory, with nothing but the pale light of the moon and their nerve to guide them. Paul Saunders led the way, a carbine slung over his shoulder, while Billy Hatfield carried the explosives, carefully wrapped in oilskin to keep out the damp. They moved in silence, crouching whenever a dog barked or a twig snapped. In the darkness behind them, the surf hissed like a warning. There was no going back until their mission was complete. Somewhere beyond the trees lay the railway, the same line Fluckey had watched through his periscope, the artery feeding Japan's northern war machine. Hours of crawling, cutting through underbrush, and freezing still at every distant noise finally brought them to the edge of a shallow embankment. There it was, two narrow steel rails glinting faintly in the moonlight, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The men lay prone, listening for patrols. Nothing. Only the rustle of the forest and the faint clang of metal as a train passed miles away. Hatfield whispered, "This is it." They went to work quickly, efficiently. Hatfield unpacked the demolition kit, a naval Mark 10 charge modified with a pressure trigger. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Bury the charge under the rails, connected to a wooden pressure switch salvaged from spare materials aboard the Barb. When the next train rolled over the line, the weight would trigger the explosion, sending cars, cargo, and fuel skyward. Time ticked mercilessly. Their submarine could only remain near the coast for a limited window before dawn's light exposed them. Saunders and Whitman dug carefully into the frozen soil, while Seavey and Walker cut away the ballast stones. Their breath came out in white clouds as they worked. Every sound felt like thunder. At one point, the distant hum of a truck engine froze them all in place. They flattened themselves against the ground, hearts hammering until the noise faded down the road. Then back to work, faster now. The charge was finally placed beneath the track, wires concealed under the gravel, the switch buried just beneath the rail. Hatfield checked the connection twice, then 3 times. "If the train's heavy enough," he whispered, "this will make a crater you could swim in." They finished the setup minutes before dawn began to gray the horizon. Exhausted and half-frozen, the men withdrew the way they came, retracing every step by memory. Behind them, the track sat quiet, innocent, waiting. The first light of morning began to creep across the sky as they reached the shore. Their inflatable boat was where they'd left it, hidden among the rocks. As they rowed back toward the waiting submarine, the ocean was calm, eerily calm. Fluckey's silhouette stood tall on the conning tower, watching them return like shadows rising from the sea. When the last man climbed aboard, he clasped Hatfield's shoulder and simply said, "Well done." No one spoke as the Barb submerged once more, disappearing beneath the waves. For hours they waited in silence, the tension unbearable. Then, just as the sun rose above the horizon, the sound came, a deep, rolling thunder carried across the sea. The explosion tore through the quiet morning air. Through the periscope, Fluckey saw it. A fireball blooming on the shoreline, debris hurled skyward, smoke spiraling into the pale dawn. The mission had succeeded. The USS Barb had struck Japan itself and lived to tell the tale. For the first time in history, a submarine crew had derailed a train. The impossible had become reality, and the war had just gained a new legend. When the explosion thundered across the cold morning air of Sakhalin, it was as if the entire coastline had awakened to a nightmare. Villagers miles away swore the earth itself shook. A column of fire reached skyward, followed by a bloom of smoke that stained the dawn red. Metal shrieked and twisted as carriages, fuel, and ammunition ripped apart in a single instant of chaos. The Japanese soldiers aboard the train never saw it coming. One moment they were rumbling down the track toward the harbor. The next, they were consumed by fire and shrapnel. The blast ripped the railway apart for hundreds of feet, leaving a jagged wound across Japan's northern transport artery. From their submerged vantage point offshore, the crew of the USS Barb listened in stunned silence. Even through the steel hull, they could feel the low tremor reverberate through the sea. Then a sound broke the stillness, the spontaneous laughter of disbelief. Men pounded each other's backs, cheering under their breath. For once, the deep, tense air of a submarine patrol was filled with joy. Fluckey smiled faintly as he looked through the periscope. "Gentlemen," he said, That was the first train ever sunk by a submarine. It was a statement that carried the weight of history. The crew gathered around the plotting table, charting their escape route. The Japanese would surely send patrols, aircraft, maybe even destroyers to scour the coast. They had just humiliated an empire that prided itself on invincibility. Within minutes, the Barb's engines hummed to life, propellers biting into the dark water as the submarine turned seaward. Behind them, the smoke of their destruction still coiled into the sky. By the time Japanese search planes arrived, the Barb was gone, swallowed by the endless Pacific. Word of the raid spread quickly through the Allied fleet, like a spark through dry grass. Other submarine commanders could scarcely believe it. The official report seemed unreal. Enemy freight train destroyed by demolition charge placed ashore by submarine landing party. Sailors in distant bases read it twice, certain it had to be a misprint. But the evidence was undeniable. The train had been obliterated, and the Japanese rail line crippled for days. On the Barb, the men celebrated in quiet triumph. They had done something no one had dared even to imagine. For weeks afterward, they replayed the memory, the cold air, the moonlit tracks, the return to the boat under the first light of dawn. For many, it wasn't just another mission. It was proof that even in the final year of a brutal war, innovation and courage could still change the battlefield. Fluckey wrote a simple entry in the logbook. July 23, 1945. Landed crew on enemy territory. Planted demolition charge on rail line. Destroyed train with subsequent explosion. Mission successful. No grand words, no embellishment, just the facts of an event that defied all logic. Yet beyond the ink, every man aboard knew what it truly meant. They had struck not just a blow to the enemy's war machine, but to its pride. Deep within Japan's home territory, a handful of Americans had shown that nowhere was beyond reach. That echo of defiance carried far beyond the waves of Sakhalin. It resonated through the Pacific Fleet, through every sailor who had lost friends in the long struggle against the Empire, and through every commander who dared to think differently. The USS Barb had redefined what courage looked like beneath the sea. The USS Barb sliced through the northern Pacific waters, heading home beneath a steel-gray sky streaked with morning light. Her hull bore the scars of countless battles, but her soul, her crew, burned with pride. What they had accomplished off the coast of Sakhalin was more than a victory. It was a statement. In the final, desperate months of World War II, when most thought innovation had reached its limits, one submarine and her daring commander proved that imagination was still a weapon. The men aboard the Barb were no longer just sailors. They were legends who had carried the war onto Japanese soil and struck with the precision of a blade in the dark. As the sub made its way toward Midway, the mood inside was electric yet humbled. They had done the impossible and lived to tell it. Commander Eugene Fluckey wrote his after-action report with the calm detachment of a man who understood history when he saw it. This operation, he noted, demonstrates that initiative and boldness are the essence of victory. His words would later echo in naval war colleges around the world. But for the men themselves, the reality was simpler. They had survived. They had stared down the impossible and returned from the edge. In the mess hall, laughter replaced tension for the first time in months. Billy Hatfield, the man who had wired the explosives, joked that he should get a railroad engineer's badge. Paul Saunders raised a coffee mug and quipped, "To the first submarine with a confirmed train kill." The laughter that followed wasn't just amusement. It was relief, the release of months of danger and discipline. They knew the war was drawing to a close. Within weeks, Japan would surrender after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet the men of the Barb understood that even as history shifted toward peace, their story would remain a testament to the courage that carried the Allies to victory. When the submarine finally docked, Fluckey was awarded the Medal of Honor for his fearless leadership during multiple war patrols, though he accepted it with characteristic humility. "The real heroes," he said, "are the men who followed me into the unknown and came back." His crew received a Presidential Unit citation, one of the highest honors a naval unit could earn. Still, beyond medals and speeches, their true reward was knowing they had changed the nature of warfare itself. In the decades that followed, the tale of the USS Barb became one of the most astonishing chapters in naval history, a story of how a few men, armed with daring and ingenuity, turned a submarine into something more than a weapon. They turned it into a symbol of human audacity, Proof that even in the machinery of total war, creativity could still tip the balance. Fluckey went on to mentor generations of submariners, preaching the same principles that had guided him that fateful night. Attack boldly, think freely, and never underestimate the power of an idea. The explosion that had torn through a Japanese train had done more than destroy a railway. It had shattered the boundaries of what was thought possible beneath the waves. When time finally took the USS Barb to the breakers, her steel was melted and reforged into peacetime ships, but her spirit remained indestructible. Every sailor who walked her decks carried a piece of that defiant night in his memory, the night when courage met invention, and a handful of men changed the tide of war not with sheer firepower, but with imagination. History remembers countless battles, but few moments capture the essence of the human spirit, like that one impossible raid. It was proof that even in the darkest hours of war, the light of ingenuity and courage could still blaze across the sea and leave an echo that would never fade.